Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and I'm here with Reed Hepler again. And this is This Week in AI, which we're doing on Tuesdays during the ChatGPT and AI boot camp for libraries and librarians that is being held on Fridays. So Tuesdays are a better day for doing this. Reed, it feels like there's so much news about AI. Is there anything else possible in the world going on? Well, of course, there are other big stories, but it does feel like this is an enormous thing happening right now with AI.
Well, and it's interesting because AI is intersecting with a lot of those other big stories that we can see. I mean, you have businesses that are changing, you have political and social things, and we'll talk about that kind of later in the last part of this episode. But AI is now beginning to intersect and be a major player in a lot of these other issues and these other stories.
I'm muted. Sorry about that. Okay, so um, uh, let's talk about the things that you noticed from the first boot camp session. I'm really
Okay.
curious because you watched the chat and you watched me present. Were there any big takeaways for you?
One of the main takeaways, and this was in every section that you had, there was always at least one person, frequently three or four people who were talking about ethics and ensuring that people were understanding how to use tools correctly, and also making sure that people understood the ways to use it correctly and the resources that were available to use it correctly, and essentially that we're using the tools for the right reasons. And there were also emphasis on being open to new ideas and using tools in the right way, but using them innovatively. And it seemed there were a few people who were in both camps, but there were some people who were more focused on innovation than ethics, and others who were more kind of, let's not use it. And there were some people also who were kind of anti-AI initially, and there were a few people, as always, when they're taught, who kind of switched camps. They went from anti to pro, and they were anxious to use it. There were a lot of other people too who were kind of focusing on, I'm using these correctly. I use it in this specific narrow way. And so that essentially, there's a wide range of opinions on AI tools and what the proper use of them is. But a lot of people, overall, it's a focus on using it correctly and effectively. But there's just a question of what exactly is that correct way.
Okay, so I think that reflects the larger dialogue. Today, specifically, there was an open letter put out. The New York Times reported on it. That see if I can find the link here. Um, do you have that handy? I thought I had it handy. Anyway,
I have it. It's
oh, yeah,
right to warn.ai, I think.
right. So
Yeah.
OpenAI insiders warn of a reckless race for dominance. A group of current, former employees are calling for sweeping changes to the artificial intelligence industry, including greater transparency and protections for whistleblowers. So I think what you saw reflected in the chat is also taking place on a larger scale socially,
hmm
especially because OpenAI is talking about they've started to train their next model. Sam Altman, I think, has said somewhat specifically that there's an expectation that this may have, it may be where we reach artificial general intelligence, which is the capabilities of humans. I think that there is the concern that we're running very fast and that there is a rush to profit, right? That the recklessness reflects the fact that people want to be in the dominant position, so they may take risks and do things that are not good. Um,
hmm
can we draw a distinction between, are we able to, do people draw a distinction between artificial general intelligence and what we call the singularity?
I don't I don't think a lot of people do. I think that people in the know, obviously, who know the nature of these things do draw a distinction. But I think a lot of people conflate those two, and there's a lot of conflating going on. When we talk about AI, we actually are talking about generative AI, or we could just be talking about ChatGPT, but we use the term AI. In the same way, a lot of people are fearful about artificial generative intelligence because, for example, with OpenAI, OpenAI defines AGI simply as a tool that can do all the tasks that a human brain can. Well, a lot of people think AGI is something that's going to lead to uncontrolled artificial intelligence development, or specifically artificial intelligence creating other artificial intelligences. And that's not what the companies and the institutions are meaning. So I think there is a difference. And I think a lot of people, and this is kind of reflected in some of the people who were responding to my blog and your efforts in your boot camp and everything AI, basically. A lot of people they won't or they can't understand the benefits of AI, and they're misunderstanding the nature of it. They think of it as a threat only. And some people just will think that, and that's what they're going to think, and we can't really stop them. So,
Well, so the singularity, if you Google it, right, is a hypothetical future where technology growth is out of control and irreversible. So that is sort of a danger point. One of the things I tried to emphasize in the first session of the boot camp was that large language models are not reasoning. They're not logical. They're not fact based. Now they're going to work very hard to incorporate those kind of elements into them, right? Because it doesn't make sense that you would use something that's not fact based as a search tool or an assistant
mhm.
to give you an answer. So, but people are having this expectation that these large language models, ChatGPT, are going to provide them with truthful, logical answers. I don't think they're, from what I can tell, I don't think they're built to do that. And I think it would require that kind of logic and reasoning to to get to a point of singularity. Now, it doesn't mean that other people aren't working on other things that would do that, but for some reason, I'm not worried about the current large language models turning into Skynet.
No, I don't think that's any danger right now at all.
Good.
In any way, because there are a lot of people. In fact, there's a Neil Postman book called Technopoly, which if any of you want a good read to make you think about technology and how you're using it, Technopoly is excellent. Um, and he talks about that a lot of people are talking about we're talking about the singularity, and he wrote this in the 90s or the 80s. But about a machine dominated and a machine run thing, and he says it's not the singularity. When technology is going to come out of control, it's not going to be machines creating other machines. It's going to be institutions and people making technology at a rate so fast they're not thinking about the ethical consequences. Basically, Jurassic Park, but for robots. And so
Yeah,
I think that it's not machines you have to worry about, it's the humans who are making these tools.
yeah. I think one of the points that has become pretty clear for me is that if a technology gives a group of people an advantage, power and profit, they're going to use it to gain power and profit. That
Mhm.
there's the temptation will be great. And so, yeah, I'm more concerned about the misuse of the technology. Like when Facebook announces that you're going to have to opt out, and it's going to be hard to opt out, but they're going to use your data to train uh, AI.
Mhm.
Well, they're going to do that in order to increase their revenues and their market share and the like. And I'm not sure I want the kind of personal data that exists in Facebook being put in a tool where someone can figure out how to approach me or to figure out my temperament or the psychology to get me to buy something. That feels like a very real danger to me, more than, at least at the current moment, the singularity.
Mhm. It's kind of scary to think, and this is kind of our little way, not of fighting back, but of basically teaching the common man in contrast to the elites. Um, and that is not a real dichotomy, I believe. I'm just referencing Frasier and all those sitcoms who kind of illustrate that dichotomy. Let me demonstrate. I do not believe there is a common man who is low to the ground. But in any case, we're trying to teach working force people like us to use technology. And there's a lot of people, like you were saying, Facebook, OpenAI, Anthropic, the big people at the top are using it indiscriminately. And that's kind of a lot of it. Um, that goes back to the right to warn.ai thing. Your reference to that document that was released by the people from OpenAI, from Google DeepMind. Um, it's a really interesting read that um, AI companies possess substantial non-public information about the capabilities and limitations of their systems, etc., but they have only weak obligations to share some of this information with governments and none with civil society. So they're basically calling out these institutions for not being transparent. And it's all kind of a mesh. And so I'm going to leave that there because I don't want to rant, but it is really interesting to think about all the implications of institutional misuse of technologies that they're developing, and while they're not communicating with outside stakeholders.
Okay, so let's move on.
Yes.
We released libraryrobot.org,
Hmm.
which was you basically wrote the custom GPTs. You give the prompts for custom GPTs and a variety of tasks that could be done in the library. Um, have people been using it? Do we know if it's actually, if have we gotten any feedback that people are playing with it? Can you tell from the metrics?
So I can see, and I can only see certain benchmarks, and then it says plus, but I can tell you definitively that we have had at least unique use of the library robot tools, and I can see a little bit what the most frequent tools being used are. It looks like your tools, actually, the ones that you had ideas for, were the most used. But let's see, um, we have the book finder tool, a lot of uses, 200, more than 200, book summarizer, more than 100. And then the next ones are the talk to a book, more than 100 uses, and library programming assistant, more than 100 uses. Um, so yeah, those far surpass any tool that I've created other than my library science tutor. But really, like 200 uses for the book finder is a really good one. And then if we go to book um, book buddy, which is in some terms a competitor a little bit. We see that, and that only has about, 100, 150, it looks like, uses. But there are some that have, 200 uses, but it looks like we're doing pretty well in terms of our
It's certainly not a
of our uses.
competition.
No,
I
no,
think
it isn't.
what we wanted to showcase was that you could do this. And we also wanted to provide a single web page where people could go who didn't want to learn ChatGPT prompting to use it in the library. I think
Yes.
there are going to be very sophisticated users in libraries who are going to create their own custom GPTs. The the idea of custom GPTs, creating a set of prompt parameters for specific tasks, and then having that be kind of its own little widget, made a ton of sense. But
Hmm.
then when for Omni, for ChatGPT 4.0 came out, clearly now there's the opportunity for people to use these widgets without being paid users of ChatGPT, which is a great thing. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily going to become as popular as you and I might think it would be. So I'll be
No,
really
no.
curious to track this and see, are these use cases that people are glad to have a shortcut for? Are custom GPTs sort of a transitory step as we move more toward very specific applications of AI? I mean, it's taking a large language model, it's creating a kind of a tool, a very specific tool using that large language model. But then, as you and I have talked about, we're going to see people integrate AI into all kinds of sophisticated things. And this may just be a bump in the road, right? Or it may be a landing place for people, right, to be using AI. My personal feeling is that it's unlikely that this is going to be where we land. You and I wanted
No.
to test that. We wanted to see what it was like. We'll see if people use it. Hopefully they do, and it's useful to them.
Hmm.
But at the same time, things are changing so fast in people's use of large language models and in their sophistication and understanding of how those models can serve them. So let's talk about what those next steps might be. Right. So I hear about agents and apps and tools. So how would you describe the kinds of things that are being created, both with AI and then down to large language models, and where are you seeing them being used, or what kind of cases are you seeing? Use cases are you seeing?
So there are a lot of, and this is interesting. There are agents and apps. So agents and apps are basically the same thing. It's just two different ways of talking about the same concept. And it's an AI all-purpose tool, kind of like there's Rabbit R1, and then there's Light O1 by Open Interpreter. Those are agents, and they're basically natural language processors or large language models that hook up to your computer. And the Rabbit R1 is nice, I think, for me, because you can have a discrete little box that's away from your computer. You can carry it around with you, but you can ask it to do things. It can order you food. It can give you directions. It can schedule reservations for you. It can buy tickets. It can do all sorts of things online. So it's a digital version, kind of like a digital concierge, but it goes the extra mile even farther than a concierge would, where it can facilitate direct connections, it can send emails. So that's an agent. An app would be something that would be not as text, not as conversational, but it still would be AI facilitated. But they're both trying to be all-purpose AI tools. And I have created, not created, but the good thing with custom GPTs is that you can call multiple GPTs in the same conversation. So for instance, my wife is a speech pathologist and she said, Reed, I want you to create a tool for me. And I did. I've created like 3 or 4 tools for her to create non-words or to create speech readings or to create ways that I can help my kids create, homework assignments for them to practice their speech and improve. And then I want you to help them create worksheets. And I was able to create all these discrete things, and I used 4 of them in a row to create all these things, and I combined them in a worksheet. So while I wasn't able to create, an agent, I was kind of able to create an agent proximal thing that in one conversation she could call 4 different tools and go from an idea and, anonymized data to a personalized worksheet, and that was in 5 minutes. And so
How do you
it's
call one? So you're saying that you call one custom GPT from another?
Yes, so I started in a conversation with one of these tools, and then you just press the @ symbol and you type the title of the other tool. And so you can have like 3 or 4 tools working. You have to do it in steps, but you can have one tool build off the product of another tool, off the product of another tool. So, I mean,
So the
theoretically, you could use all of the library robot tools in one conversation.
the idea is that it's within one conversation. So the large language, so ChatGPT is remembering everything from that conversation, but you're calling different custom GPTs to do different functions
Yes, yes,
within that one within one instance.
yes.
That
And
is
so
so
that's,
interesting.
yeah, so and that's kind of a mini version of what an agent could do, what a library agent would be able to do, except you wouldn't call it because all those functions would just be in the same thing in the first place. So
But it
yeah.
does seem to me that my perception would be that a lot of these very valuable functions are people are going to build them. Some of them, their ChatGPT is going to absorb in the same way that Google absorbs things and
Yeah.
provides a service function that someone else started something, and then how you're going to compete with Google. But there are other instances where people have created things and they develop enough of a market understanding and historical data and the like to do things that, say, Google couldn't do, right? So ride sharing, right? So there's certain functions that are, very much benefited from all of the algorithms and all of the artificial intelligence, um, or house sharing.
Hmm.
It will be interesting to see. I do think, though, that there will be attempts to make some of these tools very sophisticated, so that you want to use them instead of creating your own custom GPT and then stringing 4 or 5 other GPTs into it.
Yes, yes, that's yeah, automation and just offloading everything to the AI is a big thing people are wanting to do. It's kind of ridiculous, but
Okay, so there was a report this week that they are predicting that 8 or 9% of all electricity use will be to maintain the server farms and the computing power for artificial intelligence. That statistic blew me away. Well, maybe somebody will find that that was not true, or you can give a comment back. But it does seem like that particular piece of information, the energy usage, plus the focus by the chip companies and the computer companies on building chips that are AI capable and then putting them into computers. This went from feeling like a normal technological revolution to me to feeling like, wow, this is going to be the thing technology wise.
hmm. Well, it's just kind of proof that it's spreading and it's becoming more assimilated into the economy, into the information ecosystem, into our lifestyles. I mean, to 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 bring it back to like the automation and the agents thing, everybody's going to have agents. Everybody's going to have, their AI assistant that's in their watch or in their box or, just connected to their computer. And I mean, look at what we were talking about last week with Copilot coming, hardwired into the laptops. It's going to be an integral part of your laptop now, your computer. You can't escape from it. And well, I guess unless you buy one without it, but you have the option. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
it's going to be part of our energy grid, and there's nothing we can do about it. It's going to be a major, I mean, almost 10%. That's a lot of energy, enough to be a significant consideration for energy companies. So,
Well, you and I have talked about this, separate device. Do you have the Rabbit? I keep thinking I already have a smartphone, right? And the smartphone
mhm.
is capable of having an app that has a back end that's AI driven. So I
Yes.
fully expect to see a number of really sophisticated apps that will do things for me on my phone. I'm not necessarily going to be wanting to buy a computer with AI in it right away, because
hmm
uh, that feels like it's a fairly sophisticated usage. But the general public, oh, I'm in my Android or Apple phone, I'm just going to download this app and it's going to do this thing for me that it does because it has AI in the back, right? It has all of the algorithms and the agents and the ability to, I say, oh, hey, I want to take a trip to Palm Springs, and I want to stay in a nice hotel, and want the airfare to be reasonably cheap, and all of the things that now manually might take me 2 or 3 hours to do. All of those variable levels,
hmm
I can imagine very easily that Expedia or one of the large travel companies is going to figure out, hey, you want to just be able to say, I want the chip to be modestly priced or mid-priced. I want it to be this kind of a vacation, and it's going to give you the best case options.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's all about not having to, in a way, and I don't want to oversimplify, but basically, it's all about not having to think. I don't want to have to think about all these factors. Just do something, and then I'll deal with the consequences. And that's what a lot of individuals and a lot of companies are doing with this automation rather than collaboration. They just want to have everything done for them, and they're content with um, having things just having a process of AI to like a computer to computer to computer, multiple processes. As long as they have an output that's reasonable to them or looks reasonable, so they don't have to oversee every part of the process, they're comfortable with automating it and not having to think through all of these things.
That feels very much like the open source software versus proprietary software argument, right? The comparison, right? Because for a long time it was, hey, if you learn to do this with open source software, you have independence and agency, and you have something that's a freely available tool. And for a while that held sway. And then the proprietary became so easy and turnkey that a lot of people just opted for the proprietary. So I
hmm
wonder if we're not going to see the same thing, right? Which is, yeah, convenience will win out, because the truth is, our natural inclination isn't to work super hard, but there will be the Richard Stallman voices, right, saying, no, you got to be really careful about this. Realize what you're doing when you opt into convenience.
hmm
One of the things I talked about in the first session of the boot camp, and I'm going to talk about more, is the impact of AI on education. And one of my arguments has been that the answer to generative AI in education is generative teaching, right? From
hmm
Eric Erickson's midlife stage of generativity versus stagnation, right? You either become someone who creates and helps others create, or you're stagnating. And the idea that we should be teaching students how to use these tools proactively, not just integrating them into the curriculum or banning them. How did
hmm
people respond to that in the chat of the boot camp? Do you
Uh, I
remember?
I did see a lot of people were talking about, and this is interesting. They kind of a little bit missed your point of yeah, but a lot of them were saying yes, kids need to learn. Kids need to be students need to have good role models, and they need to be exposed to good things and use it correctly. But they kind of missed the point that they should be the ones doing it. They should be the ones doing these things and teaching. Some of them did, but the chat is usually dominated by the more vocal people. But it is interesting that um, there's a lot of different ways to put this. I like the term generative teaching. That's exemplified by one of my mentors and professors at Idaho State University, Dr. John Curry. He created this model called the TCOP model, which is TCOP. It's called the technology consumer or producer model. And basically, the teacher consumes works created by technology or consumes it or uses of any technology. and then they produce, ethical productions or uses of that technology, and then they show those to their students. And then their students consume that and consume other things, and then they produce. And guess what? Those students share it with other people. So it basically creates this chain of teaching people using ethically and effectively created things. And it basically is the instructional design version of that generative teaching where, yes, your students need to have good examples, and you should be that good example of good usage and creating things.
You've prompted me to have a thought here, right? Which is, I've watched these different moments of technological advancement and how they open the door to talking about education in a more agency-driven way, kind of beginning to the roots of, why school and what we're actually doing for students. And then pretty typically the technology gets co-opted into the hidden curriculum of the school's curriculum, and it just becomes another piece of a schooling system, which is not necessarily about student agency, but much more sort of about compliance um, and participation, and not about scholarship, but about kind of learning how to fit into the economic system and culture.
Mm-hmm.
It just occurred to me that one of the difficulties here is, in order to do that kind of generative teaching, the teacher has to be good at learning about the technology and their own use of it. And that's hard. That can be hard, right? It can be hard to figure out not only the technology, but then how to help students learn the technology. So there may be an inherent difficulty just in that, right? That in
Mm-hmm.
order to become a generative teacher, to use AI and ask the students to show their AI work, and to use prompts that relate to AI, and to encourage its use, that requires a pretty competent level of understanding of AI in and of itself. So maybe that's just one of the dilemmas.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's a bunch of resources that exist for like AI literacy things. Like, I mean, like the boot camp that you were doing, and the one we're going to do in July potentially, will help people to have, um if you attend it, it's going to help you learn skills that you can then pass on to others. And so yeah, it's interesting that you need to be able to have uh somewhat detailed knowledge of what AI is and how it works before you can teach others. I think you need to have more technical knowledge to teach AI than you need to teach other subjects.
There's a parallel here that's going to seem funny to others who haven't been involved in our conversations, but I do think there's a parallel between the media literacy piece and the AI generative teaching, right? Because there are levels at which we understand that information can be disinformation, can be malinformation. There are ways in which people use information to manipulate responses. And there is a surface level understanding of that teachers will often use to communicate, but they don't understand themselves the full sort of nature of how information gets managed and massaged and propaganda, right? So
Hmm.
there are some sort of easy things like deep fakes, right? Those are easy to showcase, they're easy to talk about, but they don't really reflect the fact that, the history of newspaper reporting has always been that there's bias in it, and trying to look past that and figure out what's actually going on. So maybe the simple aspects of AI are going to be the ones that get communicated to the students, but it's that deeper understanding of AI as a collaborator, not consuming, but as collaboration, that may just be difficult because it requires on the side of the teacher a deeper understanding.
Hmm.
Okay, so that's one parallel.
Yeah,
Um, anything else we want to cover this week?
I think that's basically all. Yeah.
Okay, everybody, we'll be back next week. Have a great week. Bye now.